Good morning and thank you.
Morning, Belinda. Kenny, I think it started recording. Maybe if we just pause it and then start it.
Hey, colleagues, let me start that again. Good day, colleagues. Good day to our panelists, as well as our esteemed diplomats from the diplomatic community, all protocol observed. We really appreciate you making the time today to join the IGD in this very strategic and I think timely discussion regarding Zimbabwe and the kind of strategic future that the country has, both in terms of the implications for the region, but also in terms of its own domestic development, and of course, in terms of the kinds of engagements with regional actors, including South Africa. I think what's important today about the discussion is looking at the context, the situation analysis, looking at the regional dimension, but also the role that actors like South Africa, as well as other actors in the region, can play under the organ on politics, defense, and security, but as well as under the broader strategic organ of SADC in terms of the pivotal nature and the pivotal positioning and engagement that Zimbabwe represents for the region in terms of not just economic integration, but in terms of political as well as socio-economic and cultural dynamics. And of course, reaching into the very, very important relationships that we have in terms of cross-border engagement, cross-border movement of people, and of course, how central Zimbabwe is to a successful regional integration project. I think today we have an esteemed set of panelists who have been dealing with and have such broad and in-depth knowledge on Zimbabwe that we are really grateful for them for making the time to be able to join us today and provide us with their insights, their perspectives, as well as their crystal ball gazing, if that's possible, about what are some of the dynamics they see going forward towards a stable Zimbabwe, but a stable Zimbabwe that has such important ramifications and implications for a stable SADC and a stable Southern Africa. And with that kind of introduction, I don't want to become too pedantic and give my own view. I think what's important today to bear in mind is where do we find the pulse points going forward? Where do we find the pivots that we are going to use in order for us to try and understand what it is it's going to be, the dynamics that are going to be both the positive impacts for the region, but also the positive impacts for Zimbabwe's governance and stability, as well as the relationship between the various tracks from track 1 to track 3. And I think these are the dynamics we're going to be discussing and ventilating further with our esteemed panelists. But before I go further, I want to give the floor to Palani to make a few comments, and then I will introduce the panelists thereafter. Palani?
Thank you, Sanusha. You'll excuse my video quality, but I hope my audio is fine. Thank you first, Sanusha, for those opening remarks, and thank you, colleagues who have joined us today. Let me provide a little bit of context. I'll spend maybe 15 minutes. I'll try to keep it even less. But what I will basically do is to give essentially an overview of a draft strategy framework titled Charting a Path Towards a Prosperous Zimbabwe, What Role for South Africa and SADC. So essentially what is this process has done is that throughout the pandemic, the Institute for Global Dialogue has been engaging various stakeholders, but in a closed format. So we've been engaging with think tanks, with the civil society organizations, with embassies that are accredited to South Africa, and those that are accredited to Zimbabwe and the region. Also with a few groups, for instance, diaspora groups that are based in South Africa. And essentially what this engagement has been about is about trying to get concrete deliberations on how South Africa and SADC could work with Zimbabwe and its external partners towards addressing the issue of sanctions, and how we could actually move towards a normalization of relations between Zimbabwe and particularly its Western partners, some of its stakeholders in Europe, but also the United States. And really what this engagement is today is an opening up of that closed space. So whereas we've had a series of closed discussions, with the business community and others who have an interest in Zimbabwe and who have an interest in Zimbabwe's normalization of relations with key partners in the world. This one has been opened up to a broader audience, still relatively targeted, but nonetheless to a broader audience. So stakeholders within journalism, within think tanks, civil society organizations, the private sector, and also, of course, the diplomatic community. And what this represents is, I hope what this discussion will do today is to bring to the fore a few suggestions and critique also on our thinking with regards a draft strategy framework towards Zimbabwe. Now, the strategy has been drafted. It's in a draft format, and our speakers have received a draft of that strategy. The plan is that towards the end of June, the strategy framework on Zimbabwe will be opened to the broader public, and it will be published by the Institute for Global Dialogue for even more engagement. And of course, engagement also with our practitioners who would be entrusted with actually taking or not taking some of the suggestions that we have put to the fore. So what we really appreciate is that our speakers have joined us. They've received the draft strategy document, and they will be critiquing it. But what I will do is just to give an overview. I will not be going through the document in great detail because a finalized version of it will be disseminated to the public. But before dissemination, we're hoping that this discussion and others like it will also help to enrich the document. In its current format, I think it's important to note that the genesis of this particular process traces itself back to the 18th of November 2019, where deliberations were held between the Institute for Global Dialogue and the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And it was titled The Best Pathway Towards Prosperity in Zimbabwe. Now, during that dialogue, Dr. Naledi Pandor, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, she urged practitioners and non-practitioners to seek practical solutions to the social, economic, and political challenges faced by Zimbabwe. She also urged the international community to lift all of the remaining sanctions and stated that unilateral economic sanctions were not assisting the country to resolve its challenges, but possibly exacerbating them, while also providing a useful scapegoat towards addressing the myriad challenges the country faces. Now, in recent years, we note that Zimbabwe has also sought to restore its credibility as a debtor, with a debt sort of reported in the region of 11 billion, around 62% of its GDP. And we've seen that in recent years, the country has made certain strides in terms of repaying some of those debts. And the IMF actually projected a growth of about 7%, although from a low base. Now, having cleared its arrears with the IMF and begun repayments to other multilateral lending institutions and to the Paris Club, goodwill is generally, the aim is to create goodwill and to create an environment where the country restores its credibility as a debtor. Now, that is an important process. And it is in this context that the strategy document that the Institute has been crafting with other stakeholders involved essentially aims to initiate an ongoing consultative dialogue program among South African stakeholders and to deliberate on possible actions the country and its various stakeholders could take towards Zimbabwe in operationalizing calls for an ending of sanctions, especially as chairperson of the SADC Organ on politics, defense, and security since August 2021. Now, there have been various initiatives in terms of recent initiatives to engage with Zimbabwe. We note, for instance, the special envoys that were sent by President Ramaphosa, which was then followed by an engagement by the African National Congress in 2020. We've also noted that recent demonstrations of solidarity have included the African Renaissance Fund's pledge of 50 million rands towards Zimbabwe in 2019, which consisted of 450,000 bags of maize meal for affected families of Cyclone Idai. Now, these are some of the more recent initiatives that we've seen, but also at a regional level, the SADC and the AU have essentially set aside since 2019, the 25th of October, as the day in which all member states undertake various activities to push for the removal of economic sanctions on Zimbabwe. However, despite this common position by SADC and the AU, strategic Western partners are still, some of them, not heeding that call, insisting that Harare should implement a number of fundamental reforms. It must, however, be noted that some countries in the West have significantly changed their stance and are now seeking to work with like-minded stakeholders to find practical solutions to move beyond the current impasse, and thus supporting and encouraging steps towards a normalization of relations with Zimbabwe. Now, this is a very important matter, because when we are outlining the international stakeholders that need to be engaged with, it's important to have a differentiated strategy and approach. So the approach, for instance, towards a country like Switzerland will be quite different towards a country like the UK or a country like the US, which have different approaches towards Zimbabwe. And this is something that South Africa and SADC need to factor in when moving forward. Now, what is also makes this matter of great importance is that we are moving towards elections in 2023 in Zimbabwe. And we see this as a window of opportunity that needs to be utilized by South Africa and SADC to ensure that, firstly, of course, that elections take place in a manner that is in line with the various protocols of SADC and the various norms that have also been set out. But also, what is important to factor in is the fact that what has transpired over the past few years in Zimbabwe has also had an impact even on domestic politics, not only in South Africa, but in other countries within the region. And so it's important to note, for instance, that in South Africa, the issue of migration and illegal immigration has increasingly become weaponized for political ends by the various political parties, a trend that is likely to become more pronounced leading up to the 2024 national elections. Now, the South African government has of late also scrapped Zimbabwean exemption permits, which expired on the 31st of December 2021 and will no longer be renewed, impacting approximately 182,000 permit holders. Now, this is also a factor that needs to be put also into context, because we see that what has happened in the region and in Zimbabwe is also having an impact on South Africa's domestic politics and the weaponization of that. And therefore, a strategy, a proactive strategy by South Africa and SADC towards the normalization of relations has to be seen as part of a broader package towards accelerating the economic recovery post the COVID-19, or at least post the worst effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. What have been some of the strategic and programmatic objectives in terms of coming up with a draft strategy? One, it's been about having a consultative dialogue forum among South African stakeholders to craft a national strategy on Zimbabwe. Number two, it's about a strategic dialogue between South African and regional actors on ways to overcome challenges in Zimbabwe. And number three, it's about crafting a strategic approach towards the eventual removing of sanctions and what steps would need to actually take place. And in doing so, the methodology that we have utilized is through various closed multiple stakeholder dialogues that have been held with key stakeholders in South Africa and also in the region. And it's also been important to engage members of the ANC's International Relations Subcommittee, the South African Communist Party, COSATU, the South African National Civic Organization, also to gain valuable insights also from former ambassadors that have worked on Zimbabwe in varying degrees and capacities. Now, throughout the process, the IGD has also received individual verbal and written submissions that contribute towards a strategy framework on Zimbabwe. And the aim has consistently been to assemble various stakeholders to a dialogue process that looks for practical solutions. Some of the leading questions that we've been asking include: what are the practical steps and strategies at various tracks of diplomacy towards this objective? What role for states such as South Africa and political parties like the ANC? What role for South Africa and the current chair, as the current chair of the SADC organ? And how should SADC coordinate various dialogue processes in the region and with the international community? What we've proposed is essentially a multi-pronged and integrated approach. The first pillar of this approach involves political engagement, and this is the primary focal area of activity, which aims at ensuring a multi-pronged political engagement led by track 1 diplomacy and complemented by track 2 and track 3 diplomacy. Now, this is a political engagement pillar, which is obviously very important and is in line also with the AU and SADC objectives. And it is aimed also to be a sustained political engagement, both leading up to the elections in Zimbabwe, but also post elections. Now, it does not only involve engagement with Zimbabwe, or engagement among South African stakeholders. But importantly, it's important that South Africa and SADC also has a targeted and strategic engagement with the international community, with the diplomatic missions that are accredited both to South Africa, to Zimbabwe, and to the region, and work out practical solutions towards overcoming those unilateral sanctions that have been imposed on Zimbabwe, and stress the importance of removing those in terms of rebooting the SADC economy. The second pillar of the strategy is about focusing on an anti-sanctions campaign. This is a strategic focal area whose success will have a multiple impact for Zimbabwe, South Africa, the SADC region, and the international community. While track one diplomacy should take the lead through the official political engagement process backed by South Africa and SADC, efforts must be complemented by non-state actors operating at track two and track three diplomacy. This will also be complemented by an engagement with the Zimbabwean diaspora, much of which is located in South Africa, in order to factor in their views on the impact of sanctions and their aspirations for the future. The third pillar is really about information sharing and capacity building. And this focal area will encompass or emphasize on research, knowledge management, and empowerment of leaders and activists working in the various diplomatic tracks to move beyond the current impasse while sharing information on the latest developments within Zimbabwe, SADC, and policy conversations in the international community. So we have to be discussing this at a more public level and not only within closed formats, and really enhance it and actually also demonstrate to the international community that this is an important matter, not only for South Africa, but also for SADC. The fourth pillar is around socioeconomic issues, trade and investment. This will remain a focal area that is an extension of solidarity. What can be essentially termed economic solidarity in efforts to rebut sanctions. This pillar thus looks at ways and means to overcome the socioeconomic challenges facing Zimbabwe, not only in future, once all sanctions have been lifted, but in the immediate period, given the ongoing protracted challenges with immediate effects, such as migration flows in the region and the various shortages in the country. So this is basically a four-pronged approach to the strategy. It's political engagement, it's a focus on anti-sanctions campaign, it's empowerment and information sharing, and it is also about socio-economic issues, addressing those through trade and investment. It will also be important to unpack and outline the role of multiple actors. So to distinguish between the roles of track one through state-to-state actors, distinguish between the roles of your private sector, of your research institutions and think tanks, and also of civil society organizations, to ensure that their work is complementary. And what is important, and I'll end it here, colleagues, is that at times through some of our closed engagement, the moment we present a strategy that focuses on the removal of sanctions in Zimbabwe and towards a normalization of relations and its importance not only for South African foreign policy, but also for SADC, but also increasingly even for the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Some of the stakeholders we've been engaging would obviously immediately raise the issue of what happens with political reforms, governance issues, and so forth. And what our approach has been to say is that the focus on sanctions is an opportunity to address those issues of governance, of elections, and other political reforms. So it is not that the approach is about privileging the economy and then neglecting issues such as political reforms. No, it is about emphasizing on the issue and the importance of the economy, and then using the strategy to actually address some of those more politically sensitive issues that we are well aware of. So colleagues, with that, I just wanted to outline the broad sort of parameters of the strategy, noting that it will be distributed with members of the public and everyone who had RSVP'd to this particular dialogue. And then that will also give an opportunity for greater engagement prior to its finalization and eventual publication in June. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Palani. I think that was quite an important contextual setting of the discussions today, but also in terms of the draft strategy that you have outlined in terms of the 4 pillars and what the ultimate kind of engagement is going to be looking at today, but also in terms of informing how we strengthen that documenting going forward. I don't want to actually go and paraphrase what you said, but what I want to do is get into the discussion with our panelists today. And we have, as I alluded to earlier, we have quite an illustrious team of speakers that are going to be reflecting on the draft strategy, but also giving their critique and their kinds of insights into where the draft strategy can be moved forward in terms of the kind of outputs that we want to achieve in terms of leveraging both SADC and South Africa, but also looking at the key issues around the 4 pillars. Let me start off with a general question to the panelists, and perhaps we'll start off with Prof. Antony van Niekerk. What was your general impression, Prof, about the document that we had circulated based on Palani's contextualization, and just an honest kind of appraisal of the kind of strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities that emerge, given that we are now in a very kind of fractured moment in global politics as well when it comes to sanctions and how sanctions have evolved. The floor is yours, Prof. Thank you, and thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Sanusha. Good morning, colleagues. Thanks for the presentation. I want to give you my overall impression. I'll be very brief. And then I want to suggest 6 additional ways in which we can enhance our approach to effect change for the better for the region and the continent, and of course for Zimbabwe itself. I mean, to start off, very simply, this is a much needed strategy, and I'm very much supportive. I don't see any problem with it. But I want to add very quickly that strategies work and bring change if they are popular or popularized and has very broad support, not amongst experts and academics only, but amongst those who are affected by the proposed change, by the people themselves. So in addition to experts and high-level decision makers and those who wield power and influence, a strategy must be popular in order to bring about change. And I think there lies the challenge for this particular approach. And we have to have a conversation about how we're going to do this. And I'm saying this because we've seen many strategies come and go, particularly in the SADC context. And one of the challenges, I think, for this strategy, which I've mentioned before, in order to garner or gather or receive or build popular support, the architects of the strategy must answer why it is that we should spend valuable time and energy on this strategy to bring change to Zimbabwe, when at the same time in Southern Africa, there are multiple crises and dire circumstances requiring similar kinds of strategies. And once we have that conversation, I think we can move forward with more confidence. Allow me to say, to make 5 or 6 very quick points, like headlines. I won't elaborate on them too much, to say where I think we can strengthen what we have on paper. I mean, the first one is we need to mobilize civil society. And maybe in particular, the political sector, and there I mean, human rights, democracy promotion, development, peace and security, colleagues in the non-state or in the civil society sector, to develop strategies beyond this one to address democratization and peace-building processes in our region in general, Sanusha, where action is needed most. And you know the list as well as I do. I mean, the Eastern DRC is sliding back into violence. The Comoros remains unstable, and there's the added prospect of violent extremism. Lesotho is having an election around the corner, and there are problems with the electoral system. Mozambique suffers from a lack of governance and violent extremism, and global dynamics is putting the emphasis back on that gas and oil fields on the East Coast. Madagascar remains unstable. Eswatini needs a national dialogue to bring democracy. And then, of course, Zimbabwe. So what I'm saying is, I wonder if you buy into my argument. Instead of us focusing everything on one strategy, why don't we help or work on mobilizing civil society to look at democracy, peace and security in the region? And in that context, you know, I'm asking an open question. Is the SADC Council for NGOs, or of NGOs, SADC NGO, is it a viable, relevant and appropriate vehicle to do this kind of work? I simply don't know. What I do know is the SADC Treaty says the organization must work with civil society in promoting these things that I'm talking about. Let me move straight on to the second point. I think in enhancing this particular strategy on Zimbabwe, why don't we partner with the SADC Parliamentary Forum? It calls itself an autonomous institution of SADC, or a regional interparliamentary body comprising of representatives from 14 parliaments, potentially quite powerful. And what is interesting, it wants to move from this autonomous, forum to a regional parliament like we see in ECOWAS. If it's busy doing that, it has support from SADC and from the heads of state at summit level. I think if they can do that, we need to partner, because we can offer training and capacity building around oversight, accountability, budgeting, law, the sort of things that a country like any of those that I've mentioned just now would need to pay attention to as they begin to stabilize, normalize, and return to a path to democracy. The third one, I want to propose quite boldly that we need to say to SADC, it must revive the SADC Poverty Observatory. The SADC Poverty Observatory, it used to be, but it is no longer. It was hosted by Mauritius. It has fallen into disrepair. And the reason for that is it's an instrument that we can use, the state and the non-state sector, to better understand poverty and development dynamics in the region, including all of those countries that I've mentioned. And in fact, what these poverty observatories do is they help member states to execute national poverty reduction strategies or programs. And they provide regional best practices to supplement the benchmarks of the Sustainable Development Goals. Arguably, at some point, something that Zimbabwe is going to need. And whilst I'm talking about the SADC Poverty Observatory, NEPAD is evolving into a development agency, as you know. And what prevents us from going to Midrand and asking the AU NEPAD development agency to provide assistance? My next point, there are 2 or 3 left, is I think we need to push the SADC Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation, which South Africa chairs until August, if I'm not mistaken, to revive the RPTC in Harare. That's the Regional Peacekeeping Training Center in Harare. It's part of the SADC Organ. It's an asset. It's a tool that we can use. And I think we can offer capacity to that training center to undertake, arguably, I might be on thin ice with some of our colleagues, arguably a security sector reform process for those countries that I've mentioned, but including Zimbabwe. And why don't we ask Zimbabwean academics and practitioners to lead on this particular effort? And let me be very clear, I'm not talking about security sector reform as proposed by the British or the Europeans or the Americans, or even the UN, if you want. The AU has a policy on security sector reform. And the key to security sector reform that works in our context is local ownership of the process. And then the provision of expertise by people like ourselves. We don't have to hire a consultant to tell us how to help the security sector to be more effective, efficient, and subject to democratic oversight and control. Okay, and then perhaps the last one is, I'm suggesting that that the strategy architects approach the EU-SA partnership called Gateways for Peace. EU-SA Partnership for Peace and Security. It's a structured, formal relationship between the EU and South Africa, and they seek areas where they share similar approaches to assisting with peace building and security. And I think this is an appropriate avenue, and Zimbabwe is an appropriate focus for this partnership. And I think we can make a sort of an official approach. I must say, in conclusion, that I've heard much about, the private sector that must come in and support, but we need to see more strategies, particularly how that is going to happen. I look forward to hearing others on this topic. And thanks for taking so much, allowing me so much time.
No, thank you so much, Prof. You're looking good, and I think you really set the tone and the context for the other panelists, as well as for our discussion thereafter. Let me also phrase the same question to Professor Raftopoulos, and to try and get a sense again, in terms of your impressions around the document, the draft strategy, but also in terms of how do we leverage it going forward, and the kind of discussions that both Antoni as well as Palani put forward. Prof?
Thank you, Sanusha, and thank you for the invitation to participate here. Very glad to be here. First of all, let me say I think it's a very useful document. It's providing some very useful avenues for a way forward, and I think it's very well worth trying to elaborate on the issues in there. The first thing, I think, just to reflect a little bit on a little bit of history. In the past in Zimbabwe, we've only had movement forward on a crisis when there has been some consensus at national, regional, and international level. That was in 1979 with the Lancaster House, where we had not only pressure from the liberation movements, but also from SADC countries, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, pushing for a dialogue, and of course the UK and the US. Similarly, in 2008, when we had the global political agreement, only came about once SADC was able to intervene in the dialogue process, in addition to the pressure that was coming from internal forces. So this convergence of national, regional, international pressure has a historical precedent where it's absolutely essential to move things forward. And what this paper does actually builds on a paper that was written in 2020 by the Zimbabwe Europe Network, which set out some of these issues quite well. And I think it will be worth the researchers looking at that paper, because there are some precedents in terms of research. One of the things I think is not in the paper yet is what are the constraints currently at work within the Zimbabwe context, which is going to make it difficult to move forward. And one of the biggest constraints at the moment is that we've seen over the last few years a systematic attempt to dismantle the opposition, both the opposition party, but also civil society. This has been done using the judiciary to change the leadership of the once MDC alliance, removal of its state parliamentary funding, the removal of its headquarters, forcing it to go into a by-election under a new name. As we see in the new recent elections, the CCC, the new MDC, has really done very well in those elections, despite the problems. But this systematic dismantling of the opposition is a huge problem. Similarly, the attacks on civil society through the private voluntary organization amendment bill, which is there, the proposed Patriot Act, which will effectively curtail the capacity of civil society groups to push for democratic and electoral reform in Zimbabwe. And this is going to have a huge impact if it's implemented. It may be one of the most comprehensive policing acts of civil society we've seen in the region in the post-independence period. The third, of course, is to look at the constraints of the ANC itself. The fact that it is going through its own existential crisis here, as liberation movements have done in this region, but also that the current president seems to have less traction with the current president of Zimbabwe than the Mbeki presidency, for reasons which we may discuss. And this has slowed down that process of getting of the way that the Zimbabwe government actually dismissed Mbeki's visit in 2019 and the two ANC visits in 2020. They were quite quickly dismissed, to be honest. And that says something about the nature of the relationship that currently exists. And so I think moving forward, yeah, clearly there's a number of issues. The sanctions issue, yes, absolutely. I think many of us have been talking about this for the last few years. This is a platform to open the debate, because we've seen many statements from within the region which have indicated this. In 2019, Naledi Pandor made it clear that even though sanctions should be removed, the political and economic issues have to be seen simultaneously. Similarly, in 2021, the SADC chair, President Chakwera of Malawi, said that even though they want sanctions removed, these have to be dealt with in the context of rule of law, democracy, governance, and human rights. In 2021, also the UN rapporteur who came to Zimbabwe to look at the sanctions question said that while sanctions should be removed, this should be done in context of a dialogue of political reform, human rights, and the rule of law. So everyone who has entered this debate sees the two as connected. And therefore the sanctions issue, if SADC is saying, yes, let's remove this, but we have to talk about political questions, that's the opening. That is the opening to bring the parties to the table and say we want, and indeed the EU have removed most of the sanctions on Zimbabwe. There's a few which remain on the defense force industry and certain individuals. The most comprehensive ones are still the US Zedera ones. And there's unlikely to be any movement on that, I would think, at this point, given that Zimbabwe is very little on the radar of US politics at the moment, given what's going on in the Ukraine. But the EU position, I think, has moved. There is a differentiated response, and that does provide an avenue. But it's taking place in a context where the Zimbabwean state has, since the post-27 coup, been shutting down political space within the country. And that's a key problem and something that needs to be addressed within the broader framework of democratic issues within the region. The migration issue, as we mentioned, also provides. We know that the Zimbabwe government is very nervous about this issue. They've approached the South African government for a dialogue on this. And so this could also be brought into the debate, again, about migration issues in the region. And of course, the way they're being used as a domestic issue here in South Africa, as the first speaker made out and pointed to. And I think that migration question definitely also provides a way forward. The trade unions. We know at the moment COSATU is not making any new progressive statements on the migration question. We don't know if they've been in contact with the Zimbabwe trade union movement, and if so, what has happened. But that movement within the trade union movement could help to change the debate at a popular level within South Africa if it was carried out between trade unions in the region, to begin to take the narrative away from the populist anti-xenophobic voices within the South African public sphere. And I think that would be an important one. Within SADC, in addition to the structures which have been already raised, there's of course the SIAC, the Election Advisory Commission, which has the right to do various kinds of pre-election audits and carry out various kinds of auditing before and after the elections. At the moment, though, its capacity, its resources are weak. And then, of course, the organ, where South Africa is currently the chair. And we know that in SADC, nothing moves unless a particular country takes the lead in taking that issue forward. And in this case, it has to be South Africa. And we need to see what are the processes, the different processes that can help to push the South African government within a broader process, both popular nationally, but also within the region and with players within Zimbabwe to try and move the debate forward. Because without this SADC movement, I guarantee you the next election will be contested once again. The lack of electoral reform, the problems that will come, the possibility of more violence, as we've seen this year, will recur, and we will have a recurring debate on electoral legitimacy, which has marked the Zimbabwe landscape throughout the 2000s. And we must find a way beyond this to get this basic issue underway. And South Africa, SADC, really have to take the lead on this, because as I said, the internal situation nationally, the players internally are trying to push for dialogue. The lawyers, the human rights groups are pushing for electoral reform, the opposition, even the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which is dominated by the state, understands that it needs to have some electoral changes. So there is a broader perspective here, which says there is this need, what do we need to move forward? And at the moment, that movement is not taking place. And so we do need this multiple track, which this paper, I think, advisedly puts forward, and I think does so very well. And I think there is a basis here to bring in more players and to combine the discussions that are taking place in various fora, because there's different groups talking about the same thing here. We need to bring people together into one forum to speak to these issues, because there's different papers that have been written on the same issue. And we need to bring those people together and to synthesize this and to strategize, put forward a strategy, multi-layered, which talks to SADC, South Africa, and the way forward, and civil society groups. Because I agree with Professor Van der Kerk, unless we make this a popular position, it could very well just fade away. And there's a real opportunity to do this because of the migration question here at the moment. Thank you, Sanusha.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think you've kind of, elevated on some of the key points raised by Prof. Van der Kerk, and I think it opens up a fascinating debate in terms of the voices, the agency, but how do you get it moving forward, and how do you create synergetic linkages in the context? And I think what's really important is that this is a very interesting segue into looking at the role of media and how media plays a critical space or occupies a critical space to ventilate this kind of leveraging of what needs to be done in terms of the strategy moving forward, but also inclusion of voices. And I'm going to now ask Peter Fabricius to provide us with his impressions, comments, and some of the key areas that you picked up in terms of how do we move the whole question of the strategy forward in terms of the discussion, but also in terms of key areas or salient areas that need to be ventilated. Peter?
Thanks, Tanisha. Also, thanks to Polani for your invitation and to the other presenters. Yeah, look, I'll be honest with you that when I first looked at that strategy document, I was a little bit shocked to see the emphasis placed on lifting sanctions, as though the problem of Zimbabwe is mainly about lifting sanctions. I was relieved to hear what Polani said a little bit earlier, which I had gathered anyway, reading between the lines, that obviously this is very much a sort of tactical, or you might want to say strategic consideration. If one can approach the problem of Zimbabwe's governments and the kind of problems that Professor Raftopoulos was talking about now, the way that the government, the ruling party has systematically and quite cynically dismantled or attempted to dismantle the opposition quite nefariously by undermining it through a divide and rule policy, within the various MDC factions. If one can approach that via the route of sanctions, all well and good. But it is important to notice, if we stand back from the strategy, for a moment that sanctions are not the principal problem of Zimbabwe. I think one can debate at some length the impact of sanctions. I mean, I know that those countries that impose them insist that they're very targeted and limited, and they only affect certain individuals. I guess there's probably some agreement that it does go further than that. But what would be interesting to me, maybe as a subsidiary inquiry of this strategy, would be to actually look more scientifically, perhaps, than has been done so far, at sanctions and what their impact has been, because I think that is an important aspect of the debate and the argument, particularly if you're using sanctions as if you like a goal, the lifting of sanctions as a goal, and maybe as a tactical route into the larger questions. I noted that Professor Raptopoulos, and so does your paper, referred to the fact that the UN Special Rapporteur has reported that that sanctions are having an impact, but it struck me as quite a strange brief that rapporteur had, by the way, to examine the negative impact on sanctions, not only in Zimbabwe and elsewhere, whereas one might have expected that a more objective framing of the mandate would be to examine the impact of sanctions, negative or positive, and take it from there. And some questions have been raised in any case about that special rapporteur's objectivity. But clearly the issue here, and all the speakers so far have brought this up, is that we have elections looming again, and again, I'm afraid the rather depressing prospect of elections occurring in an environment in which we do not believe, as the way things stand right now, that these elections will be free and fair. We're talking about the role of SADC and South Africa. It's worth noting that the last time South Africa engaged with any kind of real sort of purpose was back in 2013, before those elections, when under President Zuma, in fact, quite ironically, one might say, people like Mac Maharaj and Lindiwe Zulu and so on went up there and tried very hard to get all sides to agree to the SADC election rules and guidelines, and eventually abandoned the project because ZANU-PF simply resisted. They finally pulled out after the late President Mugabe made some very deeply insulting remarks about Lindiwe Zulu, and those envoys basically admitted that they had abandoned the wider project in the interest of preserving bilateral relations. Now, I think this raises to me the question of what the role is for South Africa and SADC, and particularly South Africa. I mean, Brian Raptopoulos is perfectly correct, I think, in stating that this is South Africa's baby. I mean, we're the ones who feel the impacts. We're the one we're the country to which the immigrants flow, or immigrants, and generally we clearly have a historical role that has been played there. I completely agree with him that for some reason President Ramaphosa has not managed to get the same traction as Mbeki, although one could examine the long-term impact of Mbeki's intervention as well. As Brian pointed out, those SADC envoys went up there, South African envoys really, but on behalf of SADC in 2020, first the government ones and then the ANC ones, and were rebuffed on the most basic points of principle. I mean, they were not allowed to see the opposition. And then they came back to try and negotiate a return which they could see the opposition, and it never happened. And I must tell you that at that point, there was some discussion within certain quarters in the South African government of perhaps trying to use their own form of sanctions to try to put pressure on the ruling party to allow them to come back and see the opposition, in terms of cutting back on aid for COVID, etc. But obviously those didn't go very far. But to devise a strategy, I mean, I don't want to be negative. It's a very comprehensive strategy, and it's got some very good points. But one wonders whether yet another plan is the solution, when, as we know, right across the board in South African government terms, plans and more plans are placed on the table, but implementation is a thing. And I mean, I sense that that South Africa is not going to be able to exert any real impact north of the border unless it's prepared to go a level higher and use some of the levers it has, economic and otherwise, to get things done, of which it has plenty. I mean, I know that's an argument that runs into a brick wall, and amongst other things, it runs into the wall that, oh, you're suggesting that we should impose sanctions, which is precisely what we're objecting to from Western countries and so on. But clearly something more than words is required, some persuasion, urging, etc., when these have fallen on such deaf ears. So, while not rejecting the strategy, because I guess the strategy could embrace some of that, but as I said, this does go back to my concern about founding a strategy on the notion of opposing sanctions or lifting sanctions, if that is to go beyond just the notion of some sort of tactical way into the problem to bring everybody on side, etc., in the region and in Zimbabwe. But I do believe that something, that a tougher approach has to be taken in terms of public statements, I mean, it was great to hear Naledi Pandor saying in that initial IGD Durka seminar that you referred to, where she really, it was quite a small remark, but quite a big one in its impact, where she said, look, we accept that maybe sanctions should be lifted. I mean, we know that's the SADC position, but we do also need to acknowledge that they are being used as a scapegoat or as a smokescreen for ZANU not to make the reforms that are needed. And so that is really where the focus, I think, has to be done. How do you get those reforms? How do you begin to make some public statements? Do you put Zimbabwe on the list again of the organ? I know the countries don't like being there. Eswatini is wriggling very hard not to be on it, and didn't attend the last summit for that reason, in part. But somehow, I think that the whole approach to Zimbabwe has to be lifted to a different level, a different strategic level, in order for there to be any hope of an impact. And certainly by now, I mean, we're barely a year away from those elections, and time is extremely short to avoid the same sort of consequences we've had before with Zimbabwe elections. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think you've kind of delved really nicely into the sanctions, utility, tactical approach, but what do you do when you have a stakeholder that refuses to engage in the political reform? So it is a dilemma in terms of what is the elevated approach, the next level, in terms of not just South Africa, but I think also for the broader SADC region and member states. And on that basis, we'll come to the representative from the Zimbabwean embassy, Mr. Felix Ndambakua. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname appropriately, sir. We'll give you the platform to also provide your remarks, your responses to the strategy document, and thereafter we'll open up the discussion. I have noted there are comments in the chat section, and there are certain participants that have raised their hands. We'll come to you as soon as we finish the opening round. Mr. Felix?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for this important discussion on my country, Zimbabwe. And I also wish to thank you again for having this conversation and inviting us to participate. I simply want to state that I've listened to earlier speakers on the subject at hand, and I've noted some of the issues raised. But I would want to state, however, that the strategy is very sound. The proposals therein are very sound, but the issue of sanctions remains critical. I've listened to Peter just now, where he is maybe quoting Minister Pando, the remarks on the issue of sanctions in Zimbabwe. The position of government is that, you see, the issue of sanctions is very critical. I think it is a primary issue in Zimbabwe. Any political discussion or negotiations in Zimbabwe is benchmarked on the issue of sanctions. The removal of sanctions is the primary objective. So there is no way we can say the issue of sanctions is a scapegoat, because really the effects of sanctions are there for everyone to see. The South African government knows the impact of sanction. The issue of migration in the region, especially when it comes to Zimbabwe, I think we can acknowledge that it is the effect of sanctions. If we are not maybe frank enough to address that issue, really, the strategy will be a strategy. It might not achieve the intended objectives. So I think my message is to say, we note that the SADC is dedicated a day for anti-sanctions activities in the region. I think that is enough acknowledgement that sanctions, the issue of sanctions, is a problem to resolving any political issues in Zimbabwe. And that route, I think we need to be very serious about that. I'm happy that the strategy talks about sanctions. Let's say we address this issue as a region. All the other issues in the strategy, reforms, the economy, etc., those can be addressed. But the government of Zimbabwe really treats the issue of sanctions very seriously. And it hopes that that same seriousness can resonate within the region in order to resolve the political, the economic issues in Zimbabwe. Thank you, Sanusha, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated, and really appreciate the insights you provided. I'm going to basically allow for some discussion to come through in the open panel discussion with regard to if any of the panelists want to respond to any of the other points made by their colleagues or raise additional points in terms of the issues that have been ventilated so far, or feel that there's something of an important nature that they want to raise and get that they didn't necessarily make in their opening remarks. So I'll leave that open as well. And if you have any questions, I see 2 hands that are up by attendees, and I'll definitely bring that in now. So let me allow the attendees to be able to raise their question, as well as enable them to ask their question and to be very precise in the issues that they want to raise. So can we start with Showers? Showers, I can, if you want to, I can unmute your mic, or Kenny can unmute your mic with your question. And if you want to just also let us know if you are directing it to any specific person on the panel, or it's a comment or whatever. I'm not sure if Kenny is able to do that in the meantime. Yes, there we are.
Yes, thank you so much, Sanusha, and the rest of the IGD colleagues. I think this is a very important discussion, and the fact that you are working on a strategy, and given one assumes your proximity to some of the policymakers in South Africa, I think this is an important step and quite strategic. Just maybe 2 questions from my side, and I'll be quite brief. I haven't looked at the discussion, so I'm still interested to get a little bit more in terms of your understanding of the problem in Zimbabwe, and perhaps not just in Zimbabwe, but broadly, the problem of the Zimbabwe question, which will allow us to look at all the stakeholders, including the role of South Africa and its capacity to play a meaningful role in SADC and the many other players. So the Zimbabwe question as a problem, I'm interested to understand your problematization. But from what I hear from participants, I liked the sort of innovation, the creativity that you are thinking about this, latching on to where the opportunity may be to deal with very difficult issues. And I think the issue of sanctions is one that I'm hearing clearly. And my question here is, does the lifting of sanctions incentivize political reform? Because there seems to be that assumption. And the reason why I'm asking this question to be considered carefully is the fact that the EU has almost removed all the sanctions. And maybe that could give us a test case to look at whether there's been a reciprocal movement in Zimbabwe in response to the lifting of some of those sanctions. And then maybe lastly is just the challenge of the dilemma of the sanctions debate in terms of how it shifts the discussion around the social contract in Zimbabwe. So political reforms for what? Who are the critical stakeholders here? For what end? And the incentives external. So the risk of externalizing the political reform agenda as far as Zimbabwe is concerned, which leads one to, I have not heard in the conversation reference to the global political agreement, to the 2013 constitution as opportunities for what could be seen as something to build on, or at least an agreed consensus point from Zimbabwean stakeholders about what the problem is and what possibly needs to be done, and how that can be, carried forward in terms of, what could SADC look at supporting in terms of the process in Zimbabwe, which would then bring back the reform question to being internal as opposed to being externally driven. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Showers. I'll now go to Vova. You, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I would like to to appreciate you organizing this, and I think it's a good idea. But I wanted just to comment on sanctions, but I don't think the big issue here, the real issue is not about sanctions. I think it's the idea of getting through track to diplomacy, the ability to identify a person, a country in this world that can start to talk to the Zimbabwean government. I think that government is open for discussion, for dialogue. They are also faced with a number of challenges, some of them domestic, and a lot of them international problems from the outside community. They need diplomatic support from honest brokers outside Zimbabwe. Yes, I commend the idea that we need to have a reference to some of the critical documents that Zimbabwe has, its constitution, the parameters, like, I don't want us, if we want to help Zimbabwe at this time, we won't look at Zimbabwe as in a crisis. The country is in much worse a crisis than you can even think of Zimbabwe. All we need is a track 2 expert, some person who are able to talk to the Zimbabwean government. What I've realized from my history with this government, of course, I've been in this government for 26 years. I'm now no longer a civil servant. If you work from within, if you find someone to talk to the government, if you're someone to talk to His Excellency ED, it will be much easier to help Zimbabwe right now, because it also has lots of enemies outside, and it has a lot of situations that it needs assistance, but of course it has its own internal problems, just like any other country. So we need a person with a broader diplomatic approach. Yes, we can talk about mistakes happening in Zimbabwe. For the time being, what we want to find out is a way to break through, to bring economic development in Zimbabwe, political maturity, growth, unity, and to stop the exodus of Zimbabweans into regional countries. And South Africa is increasingly losing credibility as an honest broker on Zimbabwe because of what is happening to Zimbabweans in South Africa. The image, in my opinion, is so tainted to a degree that we need to look elsewhere. I thank you for doing this, and I hope you will let us also look at the strategic document that you have created. Maybe we could bring in the Regional Peace Training Center is an important issue, and we can look at it later. Thank you very much. I don't want to take too much of your time. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for those comments and for those insights. There is one question on the Q&A. If panelists can open up the Q&A and have a look at it, but I'll read it out to, it's not directed to anyone, it's directed to all panelists. And the question is, as we pursue a path towards a prosperous Zimbabwe, can this initiative with international, regional, and civil society support be a catalyst for much needed political, economic, and security reforms and greater integration across the region, so that SADC's political governance and security architecture is fit for the 21st century and beyond? Thank you very much, Joshua, for that question. And I'm sure the panelists are going to give it a lot of thought and critical insights around this. But I want to ask Philani at this stage, given that both Showers and Voyo has essentially raised questions about where the strategy can be strengthened and some of the initiatives that could be brought in terms of the discussion document, perhaps you want to give us some insights and your response to their comments and questions.
Yes, thank you, Sanusha. And I must say, this has really been a really valuable input. This is exactly what we wanted. We want the critique, we want to broaden the engagement, and we want to actually gain different perspectives before finalizing this. So I think even just to respond to some of the colleagues who, I think we will also discuss it sort of internally to also even share at a draft format, even to a broader set of stakeholders to give additional input here. But I think the input that has come has really been valuable, and it can only enrich not only the document, but the process that is envisaged going forward. I think also it's important to note that the importance of highlighting the constraints. I think it was Prof. Raftopoulos who mentioned this, that it's important to also look at the constraints, both in the South African side, in the regional dimension, but also to look at the constraints within Zimbabwe in terms of actually operationalizing this envisaged approach and strategy. I think also what is important, and I think it was Showers who mentioned, for instance, the global political agreement. I think what's important here is that, yes, we should not be starting from scratch. We should not be reinventing the wheel. There are a set of prior agreements and frameworks that were put in place, which the various stakeholders had actually agreed to. And I think it would not be correct to just simply come up with new things when there is no need. We have to look at what in the evolution of this particular challenge, we have to look at what are the parameters and what are the frameworks that all the stakeholders have actually agreed to, in years gone by, and use that as a framework to actually galvanize and act as a catalyst towards some of the other issues like political reforms, like governance, and so forth. But I also think we need to take very seriously what our colleague from the embassy, Mr. Felix Ndabagua, stated, right? He said that from the perspective of government in Zimbabwe, the primary issue is the issue of sanctions. Now, whether we agree or disagree with that assertion, I think what it tells us is that, generally speaking, the approach of the strategy is well placed in a sense that it does focus on the issue of sanctions. And why is this also important? It's also important because we already have agreement on the issue of sanctions. We have agreement on the issue of sanctions both in South Africa in terms of the position of the country's foreign policy. We have agreement in terms of SADC, and we have agreement in terms of the African Union. So, it makes sense in that way to begin the engagement, and it's not really beginning, I mean, it's an ongoing engagement, but to really use the areas where there is agreement on, and really focus on those areas and say, how can we actually move towards a normalization of relations? How can we move towards the ending of sanctions? And of course, as we discuss the issue of sanctions, it also opens up the space to discuss also the broader political reforms, some of the challenges that some of our speakers have also highlighted. But I think we shouldn't take lightly the perception from the government in Zimbabwe and the public sort of statements from the government on the issue of sanctions. And I think that this is an opportunity to say to the government of Zimbabwe, we do agree that, yes, sanctions are very important. Now, having agreed on the issue of sanctions, how do we take this discussion forward? How do we put practical measures that will actually move the country and the region beyond the issue of sanctions so that we can focus on addressing the other issues of migration, so that we can address the issues of governance, so that we can address the issue of implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area in a region that is not necessarily hampered by those unilateral sanctions. So I think this is important. Another area to sort of just to close is that I took note of the comment about that, yes, you need to work with internal stakeholders in Zimbabwe, but also the comment on saying it's important to have a broader track 2 engagement. And some of our other speakers have also mentioned this, that it's going to be important to actually bring all these various processes together, not necessarily to collapse all those different processes into one, but to have a coordinating mechanism amongst non-state actors, civil society, think tanks, private sector, the trade unions, and others, to have a platform that enables engagement amongst those stakeholders to bring their own individual initiatives into this particular coordination realm. And I think this is going to be quite important because at a certain level, track 1 has its own constraints. And I think this is where track 2 can act as a complementary pillar of this particular strategy. So I think this has been really quite important. And colleagues, I must really once more say thank you very much for the inputs. And this document will be distributed to everyone. I think what we need to probably discuss, Sanusha and other colleagues, is also perhaps even distributing it to some of the colleagues who have been in this particular meeting even prior to the finalization of the document, because I think they could even enrich it further. Thank you.
Thanks, Philani. Yes, there has been requests on the chat for sharing of this document. So I would assume that it would be shared, and there'll be further inputs and insights provided by colleagues that are attending today. I just want to ask the other panelists, Peter, Brian, and Tony, our colleague from the embassy, do they want to make any kind of response to the two issues raised by Showers around? I found the issue around the sanctions and the way Showers conceptualized the sanctions as very important in terms of, are we externalizing it, and the political reform that comes, how is it going to be conceptualized in terms of, is it being political reform internally or is it political reform externally? Brian, I see you've got your mic on.
Thank you, Sanusha. Yes, I think Showers is correct. There have been changes in the EU position on sanctions, some substantial changes, but the political effect within Zimbabwe has been a resurgent authoritarianism. So it's gone in the complete opposite direction. It's not led to any new political reforms, quite the opposite. So the assumption that just taking away the sanctions will automatically lead to the political reform without a connected strategy, I think is totally problematic. And what it does, therefore, it leaves the decision-making totally within the context of the current regime in Zimbabwe, which is responsible for the issues that we are talking about. And I think that strategically and politically is a huge mistake. I think it's important to understand, as the Zimbabwe embassy official has said, that government of Zimbabwe does consider the sanctions issue a primary issue. The question is, how do they understand that? What is their understanding of it? There have been studies which show that the sanctions issue did not cause the crisis in Zimbabwe, but it did exacerbate it. So that's a distinction, an important distinction to be made. And those studies, the work can be made available. So let's take this and say, okay, if you think the sanctions are the problem, then let's open up the debate. What are the related issues? What is the discussion? How does this relate to your conception of electoral and political reform? But to leave the decision only to internal players, it will be a huge mistake, because you're taking away any initiative for reform and having the people who are causing the problem totally in charge of the reform process. And that, I think, strategically and politically is a mistake. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Anyone else want to reply, want to respond to this point on sanctions?
Sanusha.
Yes, go for it, Antonio.
Yeah. I'm reflecting on what Mr. Felix told us, the Zimbabwean government official. He's externalizing the problem, sanctions is the problem. And so my question is not to him, because I agree with Brian that easing sanctions has had the opposite effect. Sort of resurgent authoritarianism, I think he called it. In my question is different. In the view of yourself and Philani, or the IGD, did you detect signals from the ruling elite in Zimbabwe that it might be open to a multi-level conversation around democratization in Zimbabwe, which led to this strategy document. Because I think Brian is right. You know, if the direction of change will rely on the power holders in Harare, then we can make this sort of NGO noise and it's not going to go anywhere. But if there are strategic opportunities, both of a carrot and stick nature, and in my own little presentation, I sort of, you know, in good faith offered, you know, various alternative or complementary avenues to not put pressure, but to assist the process of normalization and reform in Zimbabwe. But if, you know, the ruling elite is cynical about us, why should we, you know, be nice to them? So what is it then that led to, what is it that led to this particular strategic approach of the IGD? What is it that you picked up?
I'm gonna flip that back, Tony, to Polani in terms of the various discussions that they've been having through dialogues and the track 1, track 2, in answering what were some of the pulse points that they picked up on, as you rightly point out, that were pivotal to understanding what kind of open engagement we see with the ruling elite that led this kind of process in terms of where do we see the pivotal dynamics that will happen in terms of the change or the trajectory of change that will bring about this kind of engagement from track 1 to track 2 to track 3. Polani?
Yes, in fact, I think it's a good point because it takes us sort of to the genesis of this initiative. Sorry, I'm just having an issue with my laptop. Something's not responding. But if you can hear me, then that's fine. I think the real issue here is around, so coming after that 2019 dialogue that, you know, we had with the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, I think a real push was about what are the workable entry points for having this strategic engagement with counterparts in Zimbabwe, but also in the broader region. And for us, it became quite clear that part of the reason that, you know, the various initiatives actually
Polani? Polani, can you hear us?
Sounds like sabotage to me.
Somebody heard your question, Anthony.
It could be load shed. I don't know.
Yeah. Mika, do you want to step in? Because you've also been part of those discussions, and just to pick up where Polani was providing us the context around the 2019.
Thank you, you know, Sanusha. Yes, I mean, we initiated this project you know, as a result of contributions, you know, in that in those engagements. The one major, you know, consideration, one major, issue, you know, has been that the challenges with engagements on Zimbabwe have been, you know, ongoing for an indefinite period. Something has got to give. What is it, you know, that, you know, is new? What is it, or maybe a different, you know, formulation, maybe, you know, a different, you know, approach, you know, strategically, maybe a different combination, you know, of approaches. You know, should we, you know, try, you know, to bring this matter, you know, to a speedier, you know, resolution? so that not just Zimbabwe, but the region itself, can also be in a much better situation than it currently is in right now. That is essentially what the agenda behind this project has really been. That something has got to give. You look, for instance, when we're going through some material, for this project, we started looking at the Zimbabwean performance, for instance, on how it's been repaying its debts and so on and so forth. And there were actually some interesting and positive signs there. And we thought, but okay, hang on. What then do you tell a Zimbabwean state that seems to be managing to pay its debts, that seems to be managing to somehow achieve some sort of a movement in terms of economic performance and so on? Of course, not expected to be the world's fastest growing economy and so on. But something has been happening, there, and we had to, reflect, quite, deeply on, how, possible it would be to, actually convince, a Zimbabwean government, on the need to at least discuss, reforms that are much needed. Right? Then there's beyond the issues of economic performance and economic fundamentals in Zimbabwe, the politics in the region, in terms of where we actually even stand, as South Africa to intervene there, to where SADC actually even stands to be able to intervene there. The track record of SADC, in intervention, on the Zimbabwe question, the track record of South Africa, and its intervention, in the Zimbabwe question, and so on. So all of this, I mean, we've picked up quite a lot, in the several dialogues, that we've held so far, from the embassies, the European missions, have given us, quite a lot of feedback. Even the Zimbabwean, embassy itself, in prior engagements, has also provided feedback. We also try to look at, the viewpoints of other stakeholders that, participate, in Zimbabwe, how they are affected by all of this, and the history. Country states, economies that actually invest and trade, in Zimbabwe, who brought in, for instance, viewpoints from the Chinese embassy, the Brazilian embassy. We even brought in, for instance, the Russian embassy, among others, the Japanese embassy, among others. Who, usually when you discuss the issue of Zimbabwe, you only center it, you only focus, you tend to focus, mainly on, the position of, Western players, Western investors, and so on. I thought maybe, bring in, other viewpoints, as well, to see what kind of contribution can be made, to speed up, this process of finding a resolution, and finding approaches, that may offer us, a little bit of progress. It has been a while, and we felt something has got to give, and we put together this, project, precisely to try, and make our contributions, to that broader, effort in that sense. Thanks, Anusha.
Thanks, Mika. I see we've got Palani back. Palani, Mika has just given us a context to Antoni's question, but maybe you want to add a little bit more Particularly, I think it links up to a question also raised by Albert around the institutional cooperation and whether the focus tends to be on just elites and the executive and what other institutions form part of these workable solutions.
Thanks for that, and I think Mika's input was spot on. I mean, I think this was really quite important to get a broader engagement. So we've not only been engaging, let's say, the European, embassies. In fact, we also even had a closed conversation, even though they didn't have an ambassador yet, but also with the US embassy earlier in the year. And along with a number of other missions, but importantly, Russia, China, Japan, and others. And I think what's important is colleagues, this has not only been limited to, let's say, your embassies, but we've also been engaging with, I mean, there was a mention of COSATU earlier. We've been engaging with their international relations, office, essentially. Trying to actually get also their input. We've also received input from various, let's say, subcommittees or working groups within the ANC's international relations. And of course, this is quite important because we know that we are moving towards a policy conference now of the ANC. So I would actually recommend that colleagues go through the ANC's international relations discussion document, and particularly also its references towards Zimbabwe, because this is going to be quite important if there is going to be an actionable program. And then I think maybe just sort of in closing, I think what is important, and I think this comes out quite often, is that this needs a broader support. It cannot be something that is limited also to the elites, but also, and this goes back also to some of the constraints that were mentioned earlier, is that even in Zimbabwe, it is quite important that there is even a broader appeal within Zimbabwe itself towards the lifting of sanctions. So not only, for instance, within the governing party, but also amongst the opposition and other stakeholders in Zimbabwe. It's quite important that there is an agreement on, moving forward on the issue of sanctions, because I think if the different stakeholders can show that they are moving in unison and that there is a process perhaps led by South Africa, despite its loss of credibility on some of the areas, as our previous speaker mentioned. But if the process is to be led by South Africa or led by SADC, supported by South Africa, it is going to be important to show that the region is relatively united on the removal of sanctions. And, as a last point, a lot of our engagements actually tell us that there is appetite to move towards a normalization of relations from, the diplomatic community. However, what is missing, in order to move in that direction, is actually a formal process, a formal engagement process led by SADC, supported by South Africa, whoever takes the lead. But you do need a formal process that brings together development partners, that brings together the Europeans, that engages the Europeans, and how the Europeans then take those messages to the United States, for instance. So this is quite important in order to actually build some kind of momentum. But if there is agreement from counterparts in Zimbabwe and from the government that sanctions are a problem, and if there is agreement that they want these sanctions to be removed, then it allows the conversation to move to the question, then what? Okay, we agree that sanctions must go, then what? What do we then need to put in place between now and the elections in 2023 and beyond, in order to actually have a normalization of relations so that the region can focus on economic recovery. And then that opens up to a broader discussion, because your development partners will say, yes, we want to remove sanctions, but these are some of the areas that we are concerned about, and so on and so forth. So it opens up a broader engagement. I would argue that if South Africa, let's say had to go to Zimbabwe, and as the only thing on its agenda item, it is political reform, governance, elections, and all of that. I don't think that, given also some of those credibility challenges that have also been mentioned, I don't think it will make as much headway as opposed to actually saying, look, we have an agreement in SADC and in the AU on the issue of sanctions. So how can we actually move beyond the agreement? How do we move beyond the 25 October a day of solidarity? But how do we put in place not a day of solidarity, but a concerted program that leads to the removal of sanctions and addressing what steps need to be taken in order to remove those sanctions? I think this is what, this is the opportunity that this particular process identified. And hence we decided to focus the engagement on the issue of sanctions, which would then open up a broader discussion. Thanks, Anusha.
Thank you very much, Philani. I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking we should be starting our conclusion on the discussion. There's a very interesting question raised by Louise in the Q&A about South Africa restoring its credibility due to the way in which its optics have been assessed in the context of the Zimbabwean political situation. And I want to use that as a kind of quick fire round for panelists and ask them, beyond South Africa, in terms of their crystal ball gazing. We talked about 2023, we talked about the elections, we talked about Brian's resurgent authoritarianism. We heard that sanctions is a key vector or driver in terms of the political crisis. We heard about the 4 pillars that Philani spoke about, the political engagement, the issues around lifting of the sanctions, the kind of discourse and the kind of activity and activism around it. We also heard about the 5 interventions that Antony made, and then of course the interpretation by Peter that sanctions is not the issue. There's a deeper set of questions here around governance and whether or not political power and how political power is being defined, and the crisis that's deepening in the Zimbabwean context and the regional spillovers and the domestic implications it has for other domestic political environments across the region. So if it's SADC South Africa, who is South Africa's partner to push this kind of a voice, the agency, who we should be talking about or talking to further? What about the diaspora? Where's the diaspora in this conversation? Not just the diaspora in Southern Africa or in broader Africa, but also the diaspora that sits outside in capitals, whether it's in London, Paris, or in the US or in other parts. And what is the interest of some of the actors that we have been speaking to, Philani, like China and Russia within this context? And then there was the very important issue of image, but it was an important issue of the private sector. What does the private sector want out of this kind of engagement and this prosperous Zimbabwe, not just in the context of the regional and the regional dimensions, but in terms of what is the kind of vested interest or the valuable interest and the value proposition that they get out of this. So I think in conclusion, maybe each of the panelists can just give us a bit of their impressions about what happens after 2023, where are we going with this process, and what are some of the issues that this draft strategy process needs to also think about in terms of some of its crystal ball gazing. Anybody who wants to start can start. Peter.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Yeah, look, I was quite amused by Takiso's remark that something's got to give. You know, I think if you look at ZANU-PF over the years, it's stood absolutely rock solid in its positions. I mean, with some, you know, maybe some concessions at the margins, and which has in a way forced everybody else to sort of rethink their strategies, whether or not those are really pertinent in that context. You know, so my sense would be that maybe it's a bit time for ZANU-PF to giving. You said what happens after 2023. Well, obviously what happens after 2023 will depend on how that election goes. I mean, if it's more of the same, then I presume the sanctions will remain in position, particularly the US sanctions, which, as several speakers have pointed out, are the key ones. And we'll be having this same discussion, and you know, in a couple of years' time. I mean, that's where we do need the change, clearly, to have an election which can be generally assessed to be, you know, within the parameters, at least of the SADC's own guidelines, and that's, you know, I don't know whether there's much more that I could add to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Anyone else? And Tony?
Yeah. So it's not only elections elsewhere in the region, but it's our own election in South Africa that's going to determine pathways forward. It's a tall order, Sanusha, to answer your question, you know, how's the world going to change and how do we fit in and how do we adjust and so on. It's very important questions, of course. We can only begin to reflect on it. Maybe another session by the IGD would be useful. But the burning question is how does South Africa restore its sort of, you know, tainted, compromised position and stature in continental affairs and beyond even. And that's a tough one to answer, and many of us reflect on this quite deeply. And I think we're busy reading the policy documents of the ANC to see what is different and new. And maybe that's an entry point, Sanusha, for the IGD to pick up on. But I must say that, you know, our foreign policy of Ubuntu was approved by Cabinet in 2011, I think, and not really used vigorously to shape direction. So that thing needs to be reimagined, redesigned. I mean, the world has really changed since then. The second one is, you know, we hear that that our cabinet has approved a national interest document or doctrine. There's no point in doing these things if they are not shared, you know, more broadly with civil society, the non-state sector. They keep it very close to their chest, and they need to release it. And we need to debate it. What is in South Africa's interest? Why are we in Cabo Delgado? Why should we design a strategy to assist Zimbabwe to return to democracy, etc., etc.? And then thirdly, you know, we lack political leadership in the institutions that matter most. Foreign affairs, but not only DIRCO, you know, the security cluster more broadly. In fact, the presidency has a big hand in directing our international affairs and international relations. And so it's a combination of these institutions, political players, the world, and then maybe a final point. I'm getting to ramble a bit. The final point is, I like many of us, we would like to see a recapacitated foreign service where you don't have political appointments of retired and fading politicians to take up ambassadorships in important centers of power and influence. But the opposite, you want professional diplomats, well-trained, polished, understanding, you know, the national interest, not the ruling elite's interest, the national interest, to go and represent us abroad and push for peace and security and, of course, you know, economic opportunities. And that will require quite a lot of work for DIRCO. That turnaround strategy, I think, is also needed. So all of these things, I think, are necessary before we can talk of any impact on what's going to happen in Eswatini, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, etc. So there's work ahead. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. Brian?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all the comments, and thank you to Anthony and Peter and Pilani as well for really good inputs here. I think that one of the things we need to talk about is the long-term legacies of liberation movements in the region, because we need to confront them with their agendas which led them into struggles. How are those playing out now? What does it mean for the politics of the post-colonial state to reflect on those legacies? And what does this mean for the broader democratic debate within the region as a whole? And I think that that means looking beyond, in terms of Zimbabwe, beyond the 2023 elections. And even South Africa, even now, I mean, leadership of the ANC are asking those questions within the ANC. So I think this is something that we know that the liberation movements have their meetings, but it's time for broader civic groups and others to have this discussion themselves about the legacies of the liberation movement and what they mean for us in the current context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Our colleague from the embassy, any last comments?
Thank you, Sanusha. I would want to thank everyone for their insights on the subject matter at hand. I think, well, we might disagree on a number of issues, especially, you know, I've been listening to the debate surrounding the issue of sanctions. I admit we feel differently, and again, I wouldn't want to be engaging the panel as a politician. No, I'm simply a diplomat, and I've been triggered, you see, by the title of the discussion, Charting a Path Towards a Prosperous Zimbabwe. You see, if we are really concerned about prosperity in Zimbabwe, then we need to admit some of these hard facts. We are not going to debate about the sanctions. Brian said there are studies which really do not think that sanctions are the problem in Zimbabwe. That is another a subject for another day. But I would want to really say, Sanusha, is maybe my last remarks. The sanctions issue is affecting the smooth running of regional groupings. SADC, COMESA, you go to the AU, everywhere. They are a blunt, cohesive instrument which has adversely affected the country, Zimbabwe, the region, because of, you know, migration of Zimbabweans. We are all over because of the hardships. You see, the implosion of the economy is affecting our neighbors. We know that here in South Africa, for example, they are feeling the heat. You see, so what we need is, for this strategy to work, I think we need a really dispassionate diagnosis of the problems. Sanctions, like I said, as a primary issue in Zimbabwe, the government is really seized with this matter as part of the re-engagement and engagement thrust. Thank you, Sanusha.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated for all the comments and the insights and the reflections that were made by our panelists on the draft strategy document. I think it's a very important discussion that needs to be ventilated further. We can't just have it in 2 hours or in 2.5 hours. I think we have to have an ongoing discussion. I think what this has done is raised a number of key points that we have to go back as IGD and look at how we strengthen the document in terms of incorporation of the comments. And I think for me, very, very critically, is the question of what do ordinary Zimbabweans want? Do they see the issue of sanctions in the same way as perhaps we in think tanks, elites, etc., put the issue front and center? What will make ordinary Zimbabweans want to go back to Zimbabwe, which is a key question. And of course, that's a key question for every society right now in terms of the current dynamics we are seeing with regard to challenges around not just our regional space, but also our domestic space, and importantly, in terms of what is the relationship between the ruling elite and the ordinary citizens. And I think that's something that we have to think about if we want to chart a prosperous Zimbabwe, which is not just for Zimbabwe, but I think the questions that Tony, Brian, and Peter raised around how do we get to that point of what is the social contract and how do you revitalize it? And finally, I think there is a very fundamental question inherent in the Southern African region, is the question of what are the limits to liberation struggle politics? Have we reached that point where there are limits to change? And we know that this challenge of legacy politics and legacy liberation movements keeping that kind of dynamic of political dynamism in their kind of psyche. We kind of see a disconnect with ordinary people on the ground. There's the youth factor. Even in South Africa, there's a disconnect. So I think very often we tend to look at these in the context of how we move forward and what is the role of different civic organizations, whether within the SADC context and outside of the SADC context. And most importantly, the role that we as think tanks, as a track 2 actor should be playing in terms of facilitating beyond just where we see the ventilation points, or we see the points in terms of something's got to give. I think something is going to give. And if we follow what's happening globally, regionally, and continentally, we're reaching beyond the tipping point here. So I want to hand back to Polani on the next steps forward, and of course, allow him to do the vote of thanks, and then we can keep in contact with colleagues and of course share the draft report with the draft strategy report with attendees as well. Polani?
Thank you, Sanusha. Thanks for facilitating this conversation. I think it's been very rich and definitely will enrich this process going forward. Colleagues, we will share the draft with those especially who have requested to further have a look at the draft and to add additional input into the draft. Please do contact us. So you can contact us directly through the, at least the invitation would have given a contact details there. So if you do, want to have a look, we've noted, of course, those who want to have a look at the draft as it sits now, and we will distribute it to those. But if there are any others, please do reach out to us. What we will see is we will use the rest of the year to continue this dialogue, to broaden the dialogue, to engage with various diaspora groupings based in South Africa, but also outside of South Africa. And we will basically take this initiative forward so that in as much as there is a strategy, but I think that strategy has to be complemented by strategies that are developed by civil society, by trade unions, and by think tanks to ensure that this initiative is not limited to a particular document, but that it is actually encompasses actual practical steps and measures that could be taken. So do look out for the draft and also continue to engage in this process moving forward, especially as South Africa sort of wraps up its time at the SADC Organ, but of course remains within the Troika. So with those remarks, colleagues, thank you very much. This has been really quite helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Yes.
Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you, colleagues.